Welcome to the fourth and penultimate Bartlett School of Planning public lecture for this year. If you've been to one of these previously, you'll know that my name is Nick Gallant. I organise, I convene, but it's actually the speakers that do all the hard and rewarding work of this series. So we've been holding these public lectures for the last 15 years. And really, the purpose is to introduce you to research, critical research in the area of planning in the built environment. We hope at these events to attract a mixed audience of students, members of staff, but also people from practice and with a general interest in these topics from across London. This year, we've made a conscious effort, I think, to try and focus the series a little bit more on practice-focused topics, which hopefully has led, I think, to maybe slightly better attendance and certainly a little bit more debate around the topics that we're covering. So I think it's been very successful this year. So hopefully you'll join us next year for the series once it's announced. We're currently working on putting that together. Actually, this year, we've so far had speakers from the University of Liverpool. Tom Moore spoke on Community Land Trusts a few months ago. Dan Ringelstein from Arup gave a lecture on lifestyles and densities in suburban settings, drawing on his international project work. And then a few months ago, back in January, we heard from Hugh Ellis and Katie Locke from the TCPA, who delivered a lecture on the challenges around delivering Labour's new towns. But the main event tonight is a lecture from my colleague, Professor Ben Clifford. So many of you will know Ben very well, and you will also know his work. But Ben is Professor of Spatial Planning and Governance. His research and teaching are focused on planning reform as it relates to the governance of the built and natural environment and the nature and function of the state. And his work in this area has focused on devolution, the outsourcing of public services, infrastructure planning, and housing quality. He's the author of 5 books on these topics that draw on his research, as well as numerous articles. His high-profile work on permitted development has been widely cited in policy and practice circles, and I suspect that many of you are very aware of it. And it's that work that will provide the focus of his lecture this evening, the topic of which is exploring planning deregulation's consequences, the case of permitted development rights in England. There'll be opportunity to ask questions at the end, but without further ado, over to you, Ben.
Great, thank you very much, Nick. Welcome, nice to see some familiar faces. So thank you, Nick, for the kind invitation for this. Before I sort of go into the main body of the work, I did want to acknowledge various colleagues. So the research that underpins the talk today has all been done collaboratively with a range of different colleagues. So in particular, Jess Firm here at UCL, Nicola Livingston, who was at UCL and now is at Glasgow, and Patricia Canales, who was at UCL and is now at Oxford, Helen Pinio, who was at UCL and is now in Washington. There's a theme there. And Manuela Mededu, who's now at Liverpool. I'm also now working on a large project related to permitted development, housing and health. And there's a full team of 10 people working on a multidisciplinary project with me on that. So I just want to acknowledge that my thinking and the research has all been collaborative. So I think it's commonly held that we live in an age of crisis. Sometimes referred to as omni-crisis, polycrisis, meta-crisis, or even perma-crisis. But this notion of crisis kind of infuses public discourse. And for planning, I think the predominant one is the housing crisis, which has come to dominate discussion of the politics, reform, and outcomes of planning. I do think the climate crisis and nature crisis are also, of course, very, very important in relation to planning and its focus. But the housing crisis has become this predominant feature of the politics of planning and planning reform. The singular title, the housing crisis, I think is somewhat misleading. I think it's probably best understood as multiple crises, including particular issues about things like the affordability, as well as the quality of housing, as well as the location, as well as the supply. Although it's multifaceted, and Nick, amongst others, have written about this extensively, it tends to just be presented in terms of housing supply. Actually, of course, there's all kinds of issues on the demand side. We can think about how housing is increasingly valued as an investment asset, so on its exchange value rather than its utility value as a place to live. We can think about various things to do with land ownership and tax and mortgage credit. But actually, the public discourse and the political discourse has very much just become one about housing supply, and that basically an overzealous planning regulation is constraining supply, which, if that becomes the political discourse, pushes us down a line, of course, towards deregulation. Increasingly, actually, I think our politics and policy making, particularly in this area, is characterized by a sort of market fundamentalism, a sort of zombie neoliberal hegemony, which in essence believes that freer markets will lead to better housing and development. And so this narrowing of imaginaries sort of seems to imagine that deregulating is the route to solve what are actually quite complex and wicked problems. This isn't just constrained to planning, of course, and isn't just constrained to housing. There's been actually a wave of deregulation across Europe in recent years. It's now quite a well-established trend, and it keeps popping up again and again. So just a couple of weeks ago, the Trump administration published an executive order that they would unleash prosperity through deregulation, with executive order saying that any time a public agency in the US now wants to implement a new regulation, they have to get rid of 10 existing regulations. So under the Theresa May government, we had a 1 in 2 out rule for a while, but they've gone for a 1 in 10 out rule there. But we're seeing this rhetoric actually here as well, of course. So Rachel Reeves, as Chancellor, a few weeks ago was talking about the need to tear down the regulatory barriers that hold back economic growth. And just this week, on Tuesday, a press release from 10 Downing Street said, a quote from the Chancellor, "The regulatory system has become burdensome to the point of choking off innovation, investment and growth. We will free businesses from that stranglehold to kickstart economic growth and put more money into working people's pockets." And in the same press release, the Prime Minister said, "For too long, the previous government hid behind regulators, deferring decisions and allowing regulations to bloat and block meaningful growth in this country." So this deregulation discourse, I think, is very, very current at the moment. It's quite long-standing, though, in planning, this debate, and in housing. So in 2012, Ed Glazer, in his book, The Triumph of the City, was saying, well, prices reflect the interaction of demand and supply, so the sort of classic neoclassical economics view. High prices for housing or anything else can only persist when demand is high and supply is limited. And then he gives the example that a lot of people want to live in Houston, but prices stay low because building is so easy. So while house prices rose in other American cities, they didn't rise so much in Houston. So here's the case study, apparently, that tells us what we need is laxer planning regulation, and then we can apparently all afford our homes. This imaginary leads us to my topic, to permitted development rights. So most people might know what these are, but just to make sure that everyone's on the same page, the planning system in England is primarily administered by local government, but highly centralised in terms of its regulations. It's characterised by traditionally the granting of case-by-case planning permissions against the backdrop of local plans, national policy and material considerations. And there's a definition of development ever since the 1947 Town and Country Planning Act, which is actually quite wide-ranging. So to avoid the system becoming clogged up with minutiae, ever since actually 1948, there's always been categories of development that are development but don't require expressly given local planning permission. And that's what permitted development is. So based on the proportionality principle that state intervention should be based on a likelihood of impact or harm. If you're putting up a small or temporary structure, a small extension to an existing house, should that really be something that planners are getting involved in? And that's a very long-standing thing. It's governed by secondary legislation. So far easier, of course, to change secondary legislation than primary legislation. You don't need a vote in Parliament. And this defines what development is permitted. In a permitted development case, local government planners can't object to the principle of development. They can't apply local plan policies. They can't consider usually things like scheme design. They can just consider some preset narrow technical issues via a limited prior approval process. Things started to change quite radically in permitted development in 2013. So it's been there for decades. But they started to change in England in 2013. These changes haven't been introduced in Northern Ireland, Scotland or Wales. Planning's devolved. Although Scotland is now saying perhaps we should expand permitted development there. So in 2013, the government said, actually, changing an office to residential use should be permitted development. And they said that it was going to be an experiment initially for 2 years. But in 2015, they said, actually, this is such a success, we'll make it permanent and we'll expand it. And they added retail and betting offices and payday loan shops and amusement arcades and casinos, storage and distribution centres, agriculture to residential, all with slightly different limits on the size of scheme that you could do. In 2017, they introduced light industrial to residential. In 2020, they introduced some new rights to add extra stories on existing blocks of flats or commercial buildings for residential use. So it's sort of grown and grown over time. In 2021, they changed the use classes, and so basically all commercial buildings were lumped together into a new Class E, it's called, and they said that could be permitted development, so you could turn those into residential use with a overall scheme limit size of 1,500 metres squared. That's now gone as well. At the time when they were bringing this in 2021, we were asked by the Town and Country Planning Association to try and work out how many buildings that would affect. So I did some work with Alan Dennett and Bin Chi, who I see in the audience, from CASA. Essentially, we found it increased enormously the amount of floor space that could be converted. So here's Crawley, and the blue are the non-residential buildings, and the orange are the non-residential buildings that could be converted under permitted development to housing, if someone so wanted. So in essence, 80% of our non-residential buildings across England can now be converted to residential use under permitted development. So it's really quite widespread now as a sort of parallel planning system. So for this, if you want to convert your office into a house or your gym into housing, there is this prior approval process. But you can't think about, is this the right thing to do in the right place? So the principle of development. You can't think about any policies you might have in your local plan. You can just think about those technical issues like highways and flooding. You pay a lower fee than for a planning permission, and there's a time limit of 56 days. So if the local authority doesn't consider it in 56 days, it can just go ahead. It's called deemed consent. Local government can, in theory, remove nationally defined permitted development rights through something called an Article 4 direction, but that's subject to control from central government by the Secretary of State. So in 2014, Islington and Brighton tried to introduce Article 4 directions for their whole local authority area to say you can't do office to residential permitted development here, and they were cancelled by the Secretary of State, who intervened and made a speech in Parliament saying that this should send a strong message to other local authorities thinking about trying this. And in 2021, the National Planning Policy Framework was amended to make it even harder to introduce an Article 4 direction. So you have to sort of produce evidence that if you didn't do this, there'd be substantial harm caused. So it's quite difficult to get out of this. The regulations allow less control by local planners. So I think we can consider this essentially imposed deregulation. And I say that because the former chief planner did once say to me that the regulations were very complex for permitted development, so he didn't think it was deregulation. And they are quite complex. So it's not just that they've got rid of all regulation, but it's a reduced regulation that allows reduced control. And so I think deregulation is the right concept for us here. So that links to that much broader debate about the housing crisis, doesn't it? Because it comes from an idea that if we could only bulldoze the planning system, then magically everybody could afford their own home, perhaps. It's very much a supply-side reform, and I think reflects a slightly narrow worldview that fails to imagine alternative ways that you might want to resolve the housing crisis, or alternative ways that you might want to promote and facilitate adaptive reuse, so the conversion of existing buildings into alternative uses. And it reflects what Gurren and Phibbs have called as fiddling as public policy. So they were looking at the housing crisis and planning reform in New South Wales using the sort of heuristic, can't say that word, of policy capture. And they were concluding there that policy imaginations are increasingly narrowed, that basically the only way we can resolve the housing crisis is through planning reform, and that constant planning reforms allow politicians to look busy as if they're addressing this housing crisis and housing affordability, whilst actually not perhaps doing that much to get to the fundamental roots of it, and in a sense actually furthering ideological and property development agendas that are linked to deregulation. I think that underlying worldview is very much evident in the case of office to residential permitted development. So when the government introduced it in 2013, they did an impact assessment. And essentially the justification in that was that why would there be vacant offices if there's high housing values in that area? And so it said it must be because of planning regulation. Didn't consider perhaps other things like landowner preferences, or all kinds of reasons that you might have a vacant office building other than planning. It also made some interesting claims. So it said there'd be no monetized costs for the preferred option of introducing this permitted development. It said that it would benefit local authorities because there'd be reduced planning processes. So it said there'd be less work for local authorities by taking these conversions out with the scope of planning. And interestingly, I think it said it may be argued the proposals will result in more houses being located in unsuitable locations, such as industrial sites. However, this risk is minimal, as these locations are unlikely to represent an attractive option for a housing provider. So I think it sort of suggests a worldview that developers are not going to be able to sell homes if they're in bad locations, and so they're not going to build them in the first place. And so we can leave it to the market, and the market will almost self-regulate. And so I think the impact assessment is quite evocative of that kind of underlying worldview that I'm talking about. PDR, I think, also helps us understand the way that the regulation is embedded in national political economies, and that we have to understand regulation as taking place within particular models of society and governance prevalent at a particular time, and taking their shape from a philosophy of governance prevalent at the time. Often people write about a defining feature of neoliberalism as being deregulation, and other scholars question that. Certainly our colleague Mike Racco talks about the regulatory state, for example, and the way that actually all kinds of state regulation is really important to a neoliberal economy. And yet I think in this case we can see examples of actual deregulation and a sort of return perhaps to almost Victorian conditions of a kind of laissez-faire view of government. I think a slightly interesting question is, where did this come from? And I think this is illustrative of the influence of think tanks on public policy. And we can actually trace this one. So Alex Morton, who worked for a think tank called the Policy Exchange, in 2011 authored a report that said there's all these empty office buildings, there's a housing crisis, it must be down to planning, let's get rid of planning controls for these. And it was further discussed by Morton in a blog in 2012, who said, no one is going to mind if an office becomes a home. We need to systematically change the planning system. Our current planning system, designed as part of a socialist utopia in the 1940s, has to be modernised for a 21st century economy. Morton then became the housing and planning advisor to the Prime Minister, so a special advisor at number 10 Downing Street. We also have the influence of the planning minister at the time, Nick Bowles, who was one of the founders of the Policy Exchange think tank, and then became planning minister. And when ministers leave office, sometimes the Institute for Government interviews them which is always quite interesting. So when he left office in 2017, the IFG interviewed Bowles and he reflected on his various ministerial posts he'd had actually. And I think this is quite interesting. So in relation to becoming planning minister, he said there'd been this revision of the national planning policy framework. I think it was a successful reform, but it wasn't a dramatic liberalisation. It was a gradual, gentle liberalisation. There were some other measures, particularly in relation to permitted development rights, where the Treasury and the Chancellor were trying to get some major change through for a long time and kept on being blocked and frustrated. He blames Eric Pickles and the civil servants who were in the ministry at that time. So they thought they'd put me in there to sort of put a bomb under it. There's quite a strong sense amongst officials that the planning system is this perfect judicious and quasi-judicial control process, and short-circuiting it is wrong. Of course, that wasn't my view, and it wasn't George's view, George Osborne, who was then the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Our view was actually planners overmanage and over-control. So we created a permitted development right for officers to residential, which, writing in 2017, Bowles said, had been a big success with a huge number of residential units created. And the government indeed did claim that it had been a great success. So in 2015, they made the right permanent, and a press release noted, first introduced in 2013, this temporary permitted development right has enabled officers to be converted into new homes without having to apply for planning permission. And that if they didn't now make it permanent, a raft of unnecessary red tape and bureaucracy would have hampered the conversion of underused office buildings and slowed down the delivery of thousands of new homes. But as geographer Alison Mounts has written about the nature of the state and the everyday state, high-level bureaucrats and communication employees often sort of construct these narratives for public consumption, which tend to provide a narrow insight into what's actually taking place. So things like written policies represent an idealized version of what might be or what they think should happen, rather than necessarily what is happening on the ground. So the government presentation in 2015, a really successful policy. We're making it permanent because it's working so well. And similarly, that's clearly the recollection of Nick Bowles there. But what was actually happening on the ground? And why does this matter? So PD has, I think, had a number of significant impacts, as I'll discuss, but it also provides that lens into a host of wider issues about our governance. The government's own figures reckon about 100,000 homes have now been developed under permitted development across England. In my current project, we're trying to identify the addresses of every home created under permitted development rights, which has been quite difficult. As a data set, we've found 66,000 so far. I'm not convinced we're missing 35,000. One of the issues is sometimes it's actually quite complicated. So you quite often have an interaction of sort of parts of buildings that are converted under planning permission and parts that are converted under permitted development. So for our purposes, we're not claiming the ones that were converted under planning permission as permitted development, but I think sometimes they get lumped in. In any case, if we take the average household size in England is, I think, about 2.1 people. So they're probably housing 140,000, maybe 200,000 people in England now live in a permitted development conversion. Now, I think that in itself is quite significant. So I think permitted development in itself is quite significant just because it's housing people, it's having effects that I'll discuss, but it also provides that broader lens into planning deregulation, so it's useful to try and understand what happens. And so that's what's been a feature of my research for quite a few years now. So we started with a project funded by the RICS Research Trust, as was, looking at office to residential. And that looked in 5 case study local authorities across England. And we did site visits and looked at things like floor plans to try and think about the quality of the conversions. That got some media and political attention, and James Brokenshire, who was then Secretary of State, then said that he'd commissioned an independent review into the quality of homes created through permitted development. I then got appointed to lead that review, and so we published a wider report that did a similar thing, looked at case study schemes across 11 local authorities in 2020. Haven't stopped there, it's the sort of gift that keeps giving. So with my colleague Helen Pinio in 2023, we looked in 4 London boroughs at conversions, and we did a survey with residents and interviews with residents. So we got 218 survey responses, and we did 40 interviews to say to residents, what's it like living in these places? What are your own perceptions about how it may impact your health and well-being? So that's a pilot study. That then led to us getting a much larger grant from the National Institute for Health and Care Research. So there's the website address. That's the one we're doing at the moment. That's 2 years into a 3-year project. So I can't really say much because we don't have many results from that yet. It's ongoing. But that involves a much larger survey across England. So we've got over 800 survey responses. We've done 60 interviews with residents. We've done focus groups, 6 focus groups with 36 residents. We've also put environmental monitoring equipment into 48 permitted development homes. So looking at things like temperature, humidity, air quality of those homes. And we'll see what results we get from that. So through these bodies of research, we've come to find a number of sort of common issues that affected permitted development homes. First and foremost was the issue of space standards. So there is this thing called the Nationally Described Space Standard, which are recommended minimum space standards for homes in England. They vary according to how many bedrooms and how many intended occupiers there are, but it starts with 37 metres squared minimum for a single person and goes up from there onwards. They're slightly complicated. They can only be applied locally if they have been put into the local plan policy, basically. They couldn't apply to permitted development schemes until 2021. So the government changed the regulations in 2021 following our review, but we've got from 2013 to 2021 when they couldn't be applied by local planners at all, and therefore it's up to the developer what they want to do. And what we found is that quite a lot of developers wanted to go much smaller than those space standards and cram in as many flats as possible. So we were finding studio flats that were just 15 metres squared compared to that recommended 37 metres squared. I think 13 metres squared was the smallest we found in our study. So in 2020, we found just 22% of the flats that we looked at would meet the recommended space standards. Julia Park, as an architect, has illustrated what that looks like in terms of everyday furniture. So on the right is 37 metres squared and what you could fit into a 37 metres squared flat. And as you can see, you've got a little area to eat and an area for social activity as well as your sleeping and washing facilities. On the left, you've got 13 metres squared, which is in a conversion in East London called Newbury House, which is, as you can see, quite tiny. There is no minimum size for a dwelling under planning law in England. So some local authorities tried to sort of fight back against some of these schemes. Hounslow, for example, had a scheme where they said the units were so small they couldn't be conceived as dwellings, and therefore they couldn't be permitted development. And that was appealed to the planning inspectorate, and the planning inspector said there is no minimum size. There's just a generally accepted definition that you should be able to sort of live an independent life within that unit. So if it has a toilet, somewhere to wash, somewhere to prepare food, and somewhere to sleep, that's fine. And in the Hounslow scheme, the inspector said, I did a site visit, and actually the bed flipped down from the wall, basically, to create sufficient space. And if you hadn't done that, you wouldn't be able to fit in there, basically. But they said that's acceptable as a dwelling. At the extreme, it links to physical health, of course, and the spread of infectious disease. We saw this quite a lot during COVID. More widely, it's linked to mental health. So living in housing that's very small can affect your mental health, can affect your quality of life. There's long-standing body of evidence that the ability to have things like a social life depends on having sufficient space in your home. If you've got children, the ability for them to have somewhere quiet to do homework, for example, is affected if you don't have enough space. In 2023, asking those residents in our pilot survey about their health and well-being, the top thing that got reported as a problem with their home was a shortage of space. What was interesting in the interviews we did there was that sometimes there were differences between people. So we ended up doing one interview with a husband and wife, and the husband said it's fine, this flat, but he was someone who was out to work every day, and his wife, who was in the home every day, said it's not fine, and was really quite clear. So I think it's interesting that there's those individual experiences of housing. In that 2023 study, we got residents to answer a number of questions about mental well-being using a validated scale. It's called WEMWEBS, the Warwick Edinburgh Mental Wellbeing Scale. And so it's a validated survey. It's been used numerous times before, and so you can compare the results of your survey with existing data sets. And we found that having sufficient space in your home had the greatest impact of all the things we asked about in relation to people's health and well-being. So we had a question, is there sufficient space to eat together, with the people you live in this home? And people who said no, there isn't, were 24 times more likely to have low mental well-being. Then we asked another question, is there sufficient space to have visitors into your home to socialise? And people who said no, there isn't, were 8.4 times more likely to have low mental well-being. The standards actually, I think, show the impact of planning regulation quite neatly. The quality of housing is a sort of complex interplay of all kinds of factors. So there's the regulations, the enforcement of them, developer attitudes and preferences, design practices, real estate finance and viability, mortgage finance. So one developer I spoke to said that he was trying to do conversions that could be sold, and banks he had found would not lend on a property smaller than 24 metres squared. So none of his conversions were smaller than 24 metres squared. But what we found across the 11 case studies in 2020, that the red line at the bottom is the permitted development units meeting space standards, and the yellow line is the planning permission units meeting space standards in the samples we looked at in all those local authorities. So they vary across local authority, particularly linked to the sort of viability and level of deprivation we found actually. But you can see the planning permission units are more likely to meet the space standards everywhere, showing, I think, quite neatly the influence of that regulation. We can also see that in buildings where you had some floors changed through planning permission and some not. So this is Windsor House in Norbury, in Croydon. And basically some floors were an office building, and although it looks like an office, other floors were an educational institution, which is a different planning use class, and you can't convert that under permitted development. So they had to apply for planning permission to do that. And the planning permission floors have all got flats that meet the space standards, and the other floors do not. The next issue was around just the mix of units. So quite often planners might try and say, can we have a mix? Can we have some 2-bedroom? Can we have some family size, even 3 or 4 bedroom apartments in a large conversion or large new development of apartments? But that couldn't be asked for in permitted development. So we found in 2018 that 77% of the flats were studios or 1-beds, compared to 37% in planning permission schemes. So that means you're not responding to a need for family-sized housing. Of course, there are lots of people that want to live in single-person housing, but actually there's quite a lot, and if we look at housing sort of need analysis, there's quite a lot of need for family-sized housing. And so where you get a mismatch and just further that mismatch, it can lead to overcrowding. So we had all kinds of evidence of families living in studios or 1-beds even. I think it can also link to antisocial behaviour. So a lot of our residents in our survey in 2023 were talking about issues about noise, vandalism and crime. Because if you've got a scheme that's 300 sort of studio and 1-bed flats, it doesn't lend itself to kind of established communities. The sort of residents who are likely to want to stay around aren't there. You tend to get a high turnover of people who are just in there on the short-term basis, and that can perpetuate issues of antisocial behaviour. Next issue, window arrangements. So we found some units with no windows at all, because that's usually something planners were asking for, but you don't actually have to have a window in a flat in England. That was tiny. That was only 0.4% of the ones we looked at, but there were some. I sort of started questioning myself on that, and then we did a site visit, and there was some in Crawley, and indeed that was the case. What you also had sometimes is, like the floor plan there, was an office building with an atrium, and so your window to your studio flat is just a window onto an atrium in the middle of this new conversion. We also found it was really common for the units just to have a single aspect, so just windows facing one way, when often planning policy now tries to encourage at least dual aspect. We also found 14% of residents reported they didn't have a single window they could open, perhaps because the office had air conditioning, so it wouldn't have windows you could open. 32% said they had a window, but they couldn't easily see the outside world through it. So perhaps it's up quite high or something like that. Often there were strange internal layouts, sort of dog legs and all kinds of weird shapes where you've got deep floor plan office buildings trying to cram in as many flats as possible. So you might have a window, but it doesn't really let natural light into much of your dwelling, or it could of course be opaque or non-opening. The government did change the regulations in 2020 and said that you have to have adequate natural light to all habitable rooms in a permitted development conversion. You don't have to have a window, actually. So soon after that came in, I got sent some floor plans where there were flats with skylights and sort of light pipes only, and still no windows. Dual aspect often links to, or single aspect links to an issue in particular about overheating in the home or with thermal comfort. So if you just have windows facing south, it's very likely to get very hot in the summer. If you just have windows facing north, it can be a particular problem being too cool in the winter. And only 37% of our survey respondents said they could not keep comfortable in their permitted development home during hot summer weather. That top scheme in Reading was talking about this in one of my seminars, and one of my students turned out to live there, but said that he had to leave the flat in the summer because it was so unbearable. In interviews, actually thermal comfort was the most commonly cited feature that people felt affected their health and well-being when they were sort of talking about living in their home. So there's definitely a health link from that. Also, a lack of a view of the outside world has been linked to studies of mental health. Thermal comfort widely linked to physical health in all kinds of pathways, but that can also be associated with mental health. And given future climate change scenarios, I think this is going to become increasingly something we should care about. Next issue, outdoor space. So planners will often ask now if we're doing high density schemes for there to be what's called amenity space, basically outdoor space, so balconies, roof terraces, things like that. But in the case of permitted development, couldn't ask for that, still can't ask for that. So in 2020, we found just 3.5% of the flats had access to private outdoor space at the schemes we looked at. There's a potential link, obviously, to people's health and well-being there. I think this was brought into sharp focus through the COVID pandemic. We're spending so much time at home, people really valued access to outdoor space. But it also perhaps mitigates. If you have small space standards, but you have some private outdoor space, there's perhaps a trade-off there. If you've got really small space standards and no outdoor space, it's doubly problematic. Access to outdoor space was the most common thing cited in interviews that people valued. They said having access to green space, outdoor space, really improves my mental health and well-being. And of course it can be compounded because these aren't going through a proper planning process. If the flats haven't got outdoor space and then there isn't nearby green space in the neighbourhood itself. Something else that is required certainly in the London plan is play space. If you're doing more than a certain number, well, if there's likely to be more than a certain number of children living somewhere, the developer should provide play space. That couldn't be required here. And we had reports of children playing in car parks, corridors, and so on. And then location. Because some of these conversion issues about the design could potentially be fixed, but it's much harder to fix location. On average, if we just looked across all the schemes we looked at, and you just took averages of things like access to green space, public transport, open space, the permitted development schemes weren't worse than the sample planning permission schemes we looked at. But it's not just about the averages, it's about what's possible at the extremes. So most conversions are in sort of city and town centres, local high streets, existing residential areas that aren't too problematic in most cases. Although that scheme on the bottom right in Leicester is above a nightclub, so residents there were complaining quite a lot about the noise from that. But the extremes matter. So only 8% basically of permitted development schemes were in an industrial estate or business park, but that was 8 times as many as the planning permission schemes we looked at. It was very rare for planners to allow those sort of schemes to go ahead. So that could include locations prone to atmospheric pollution. Scheme on the right is sandwiched between the North Circular Road and actually there's a cement works right behind that one. So, you know, externalities from industrial uses next to them, busy roads, things like that can impact your physical health as well as noise concerns as well. And of course that you can sort of spiral and link between these. So you might have a window you can open, but you don't want to open it because you've got that extremely noisy road right outside. But if you don't open the window, the flat perhaps is prone to overheating. We also found some locations that were really remote from infrastructure, social infrastructure, GPs, schools, shops, public transport. This is associated with higher mental well-being, we found in our survey. This was particularly a problem in new towns. So new towns from the 1950s were designed with quite a high level of spatial segregation, as was the planning view at the time. And so you do have large industrial areas in places like Crawley or Harlow. And suddenly you had some office buildings there that got converted. So bottom right is Templefield's house in Harlow in Essex. And it is in the middle of an industrial estate. When I did a site visit there, right behind it is some fuel tanker bunkers and all kinds of quite active industrial uses. It's really remote from any kind of social infrastructure or green space. So the issue there is that the location can be really problematic. It's not in every case, but it can be extremely bad. And then more generally, we just found this sort of culture of deregulation. So it seems to have attracted some of the less reputable SME, small and medium enterprise developers. I'm just thinking of some. There were a couple in Croydon. There was one who had numerous convictions for fly tipping, dangerous dogs, things like that. There was another one who crashed his car, killed his girlfriend while he was high on cocaine. Yeah, there's all kinds of interesting characters associated with this. And I think then, even though there are some regulations, it was a culture of this is a space that's opened up where there's less kind of likelihood of enforcement action by the state. And so we won't even comply with the rules we're supposed to be complying with. So when we started looking, trying to work out where the flats were, there's energy performance certificates, there's the valuation office agency that does the council tax records, there's data from planning data, and we were finding in some cases they didn't agree with each other. So just the number of flats in a building was different between all of these. In fact, the very first site visit we did in our 2018 report was just on Evershot Street beside Euston Station. And we had the plans that had been submitted to Camden Council that showed 4 flats. And we were looking from the outside, and the landlord would actually happened to be there. And he said, "What are you doing?" And we said, "Oh, we're interested in these conversions." And he was very proud. And he said, "Oh, it's great. I've been able to convert this building, and there's 7 flats in there." And I was like, "Oh, are there really?" There were also cases where energy performance certificates were just missing. So you're meant to have them for all new homes, but they just didn't exist. We found some where there were inadequate mail delivery arrangements, so like signs just pinned up saying, this is such and such address, pop the parcels around the back or whatever. Inadequate utilities provision. So in some schemes, basically the water, or we heard in one case in Bristol the other week, the sort of sewage network basically wasn't sufficient. It was fine for it as an office building, but not as residential, and so kept failing. Broadband provision, not sufficient sometimes, or adequate, and you can't get another provider if you live in the middle of this large office building, if that infrastructure is not there. Poor ventilation, noise insulation, perhaps it's been carved up in a way where the ventilation worked fine for a large open plan office, but not for lots and lots of small cellular studio flats. Government has often said the issues can't be too bad because the building regulations apply to these schemes still. So they don't need planning permission, but they still need building control. And the Town and Country Planning Association did a piece of work that they've just published in February. And they said, well, actually, it turns out once they looked into it that if you're doing what's called a change of use scheme, a material change of use scheme, the building regulations are less strong than a new build. So the government's saying, well, the building regulations apply. Actually, the building regulations are far weaker for these schemes than they would be for a new build. And there seemed to be a sort of complete lack of understanding of that. And I wasn't sure, because I met with the TCPA, whether we'd got that right. And then we met with the building safety regulator who said we had. And they are now doing a review into that as to whether the building regulations are sufficient for these. Even when they apply, the building regulations can be problematic, as I think we saw in the Grenfell case. But as Ross Spencer and colleagues found in a report published in 2020, it's called Journeys in the Shadow Private Rented Sector. Actually, there's quite widespread criminal behaviour sometimes in the private rented sector. And so just thinking that kind of developers and landlords would have followed the regulations and therefore things can't be too bad, I think is quite naive at best. We've also sometimes been said, well, if they're really that bad, you know, housing, environmental health enforcement could deal with these. But I think given local authority resource constraints, it's very difficult actually for that to be the case. You might have one or two housing enforcement officers across a borough with, you know, thousands of homes in the private rental sector in some cases. There's all kinds of things also that you might do with a planning permission. So you can put conditions about making sure that you're notified when you commence the development and you complete it, and those weren't being done with permitted development. So I think they were harder to monitor. And there are various things that a planning permission sort of triggered, so street numbering and naming, that weren't taking place properly when these things first came in 2013, because local government suddenly had whole new processes to try and work through. This is from a survey the TCPA did a few months ago and said to planning and housing officers, what's preventing you from taking action against really poor quality permitted development conversions? And the top thing on the left there is under-resourcing of enforcement. So basically, yes, there are, you know, things like the housing health and safety rating system, but you have to have someone to take that enforcement action in the first place. So with those health impacts, overall in 2023, we found that permitted development residents were more likely to have low well-being than the UK average, and they were less likely to have high well-being. So you look at sort of both ends on that scale. The public health origins of planning, I think, weakened over time. So that's, you know, the origins of the planning movement, certainly in the UK. And I think over time it became seen that was, you know, that was kind of resolved. It's not a developed world issue anymore. But it seems that it still is. And housing is a key social determinant of health. And given existing studies about the various sort of exposures and pathways that can exist between those exposures and health outcomes, and the problems we've found with permitted development housing, you can see how it could affect quite negatively people's health and well-being. There's also, I think, quite an important equalities dimension to this. So if we think of the sort of cumulative interplay, the environmental factors could be more problematic if you experience other socioeconomic disadvantages. So you can have greater vulnerability to environmental exposures and, of course, less power and agency to change your circumstances. So, you know, young professionals who perhaps are living in a small studio flat, but they know it's short term and they do have the agency to move on, perhaps it's not as problematic for those as opposed to other people who don't have that, who end up living in these schemes and really can't live anywhere else. I think there's other sort of potential social impacts as well. So these schemes, they weren't getting planning permission, so you didn't have to make contributions to affordable housing or any infrastructure. So don't have to pay Section 106 or SIL. And so that leads to a very real loss of the sort of infrastructure that could support these schemes. The government's impact assessment in 2013 said, well, they're already an existing building, so the infrastructure is already there. But an office building doesn't involve demands on social infrastructure, GP surgeries, schools. It doesn't quite put the same burden on green infrastructure like parks locally. And of course, the affordable housing loss as well. Found plenty of evidence of the profitability of these schemes. So Windsor House, I mentioned earlier in Norbury, when it got permitted development prior approval, its value went from 925,000 to 25 million. You can see that in the land registry data, and yet you're not having to provide any planning gain that would reflect that uplift. Most concerning that the poorest quality tended to be used for temporary accommodation. So the poorest quality schemes are not mortgageable. You could not sell these flats. There perhaps aren't that many people who want to rent. There are some, but not that many who freely want to rent. So a number of developers found, well, we could use them for temporary accommodation. And that's what we've been investigating a bit more under the current project. So we thought and found that just doing a survey where you send a postcard to a resident saying, please fill in our online survey, doesn't necessarily reach those residents. So we worked with some grassroots campaigning organisations in Harlow, Harrow, Croydon and Bristol. And we've done these 6 focus groups that we've just finished with residents. And they were quite depressing, quite evocative. So we're finishing also our survey and interviews, but particularly the permitted development conversion residents who came to these focus groups almost universally were extremely critical of the quality of their housing and the impacts it had on them. So tales of things like, overheating so bad that in the summer months you would spend hours walking the street just to avoid being at home, or you wouldn't cook in your own home because that adds to the overheating problem. This is Imperial Apartments, which is the largest conversion in Bristol, 465 flats used for temporary accommodation. But these quotes are from actually all our focus groups. But, comments like, people can't believe how mental it is there. They think you're making up stories. Once you're there, you're stuck. So although they're meant to be temporary accommodation, there were lots of residents who'd been living in these places for 5 years, because kind of once the local authority had put them there, they were no longer in immediate housing need. I don't feel settled, I can't settle. Everyone says I've got to get out of here. The place is no home. These places shouldn't be allowed to exist. That's when I said, can you improve them? What could you do to improve your home, I asked. And people said, these places shouldn't be allowed to exist. You can't improve them. Quite evocatively, I think everything's magnified there. So this notion you've got really small space standards. So you're in a tiny studio flat. There's hundreds of residents. There's paper-thin walls where you can hear your neighbour. And so everything gets magnified and just feels all the worse. So it's not like a prison. It is a prison. It's not a flat. It's a self-contained room. The place is like a sweat box in summer. The environment puts you down so much. It just makes things worse for you being there. Being there feels like a squishing of the mind. Sometimes I just cry. I think these quotes, regarding feeling unsafe, unhealthy, talking about overheating, mold and damp, pests, and feeling also that you're trapped and you can't move on, if you're a temporary accommodation person, exemplify a strong feeling that these places don't constitute a home. So the recent paper by Priest and Flint, they talk about this sort of historically embedded and deeply held socio-cultural ideal within English culture of the home as permanent, comfortable, and keeping us physically, emotionally, and ontologically safe. But when this equivalence of home with haven is disrupted, that can have dramatic impacts on us, and people could be marginalised within urban life. And what I found really quite interesting was you could have these conversions, and there's like 100 flats there, and then nearby are neighbours who have no idea quite what conditions are like within those homes. And some of the residents would say to us that they avoided going out. They avoided, The studio flat was awful, but they avoided leaving it because it was just getting them down so much. And McCarthy similarly says housing on its own is not sufficient to the attainment of home. And I think that's quite evocative. These are units, not homes. There's a sort of unhoming going on here. There's also, just beyond the housing quality issues, all kinds of other broader issues as well. So the actual existence of permitted development impacts real estate markets and values. Certainly the increased profitability stirred the market and did increase interest in change of use, and some developers have built their business model around these schemes. But it affects things. So one developer who used to do conversions before permitted development told us that he basically couldn't afford to do high quality anymore because he'd just get outbid by the people who were prepared to do lower quality. There was evidence that actually in weaker markets, so London's quite different, but once we got to places like Leicester, there was actually fewer new build schemes coming through, fewer new build apartments because there was such a glut of these PD conversions. So the presence of PD is having broader impacts. Similarly, there's a lack of protection now for employment space within our planning rules. And so I think that affects the kind of calculations of value and business models and whether you're going to build new office space. There's been a lot of discussion recently about whether we should have a zoning system. But actually, even if you have a rigid zoning system, that often comes with protection for non-residential uses. But in England now, we don't have that, and we don't have protection for these spaces. And that, I think, can affect the sort of fine-grained mix of uses between residential and non-residential uses that makes places like, actually here in Camden, feel so valued. When we're in Reading, the council's economic development officer was giving us examples of businesses that had left Reading because they could not find suitable premises, particularly things like the creative industries that actually value lower quality space. So you might say, well, if there's much office demand, people will build a new office building, but some people don't need or want or afford a sort of Class A brand new office building. That secondary stock is useful for some people. So I think this undermines the sort of place curation role that planning can place. And you have seen occupied or partially occupied space being lost through these rules. Just the kind of final key point is that none of this is saying that adaptive reuse is a bad thing. So converting obsolescent commercial buildings into other purposes can be good for regeneration. It's being really widely linked now to sustainability debates. So buildings are a really significant source of global carbon emissions. If you make things like their heating and so on much more efficient, actually more and more the debate then has to come about the embodied carbon, the carbon that's gone into building them and their structures. And a UN report from 2023 says, well, if we're going to encourage a circular economy approach, actually we should be reusing buildings more. The construction industry is actually the largest single emitter of carbon globally. So there's growing international interest, particularly post-pandemic, in conversion. And I always have to remind people, not all PDR conversions are poor. I've been in some very nice ones. Actually, some really high-quality ones have been provided, but that was because the developer decided to, rather than because any regulation required them to. But I think the interesting question is, was this necessary, even if we want adaptive reuse? So this chart shows the government figures for a number of schemes, the number of new dwellings created through conversion. And dark blue is permitted development, light blue is just through planning permission. So change of use has always happened, even when it had to have full planning permission. And we had quite a rate long before permitted development came along. For sure, it did then boost the rate. And as I said, stirred the market, but it's not that this was impossible under full planning permission. So I think that speaks to more complex debates about how you balance socio-economic environmental factors in regulation. And in our 2018 report, we did look at international comparison. So we looked at, in that report, the Netherlands. So in the Netherlands, they had a problem with lots of vacant office space. They have a housing crisis. They wanted to encourage it, They didn't deregulate planning, though. They took what we're terming a sort of softer governance approach. And that involved proactively trying to identify owners of buildings, contact them, encourage them to convert, having officials in local authorities who would do that work, asking local authorities themselves to essentially produce planning instruments that showed where they wanted conversions to take place and where they did not want them to take place. And then central government, the ministry, produced all this guidance on basically how you do office to residential conversions and what good looks like. We haven't really specified through the UK government what we think good looks like in this space. And similarly with Manuela Madedu, we looked in comparison between Italy and the UK and the sort of rigid rules there and the effect that had on quality. The interesting thing in the Netherlands was that if you adjusted for population, they actually had a higher rate of conversions without having gone down the deregulatory route. So, I think this decade of housing created through permitted development offers us a fascinating lens into quite a few different planning, housing and built environment issues. So we can use it as a lens to talk about the state and regulation, the relationship between reforms and outcomes in the built environment, the kind of practices of planners and design professionals, perhaps the ethics of some professionals who have operated in this space, the kind of market fundamentalist ideologies that seem to sort of typify our governance at the moment, what good housing design requires, etc., etc., etc. Not all PDR schemes are bad quality. More housing has been delivered this way than if we did nothing else at all. But I think there's a range of diseconomies that become apparent. At its worst, some PDR conversions are of appallingly low quality. So more than one interviewee in our research described them as the slums of the future. The worst ones are low quality and in really poor locations, such that they're likely to be having a really detrimental impact on the health and well-being of those residents. And that's particularly problematic, I think, if they're being used for temporary accommodation to house the most vulnerable in our society. And that's what we're exploring further through the current research project. But even what at first sight looks like some of the better quality conversions, nicer finishing, better space standards, we're finding quite a few of those seem to have problems with things like overheating in particular. And in all cases, even the really, really good, really nice conversions didn't have to provide any affordable housing, didn't have to make any other planning gain contributions. And so I think there's a question about the implications of that alone, if nothing else. I think that the PDR debate is also illustrative of the kind of weak power of the local scale in UK territorial politics and the current state of local government. So Jamie Peck talks about scalar dumping and the sort of dumping of blame that's gone on here. So central government has said, well, local authorities have lots of powers around environmental health and housing. They can enforce housing standards. So what's the problem? If these are really bad, they can take enforcement action. But of course, they're completely underfunded and under-resourced to be able to do that in practice. And so sort of blaming local government and saying, well, it's their fault if they're not doing that, I think is quite problematic. Local government has also, and perhaps this is because of austerity, of course, I think sometimes failed to be proactive themselves in sort of saying where they think conversions should or shouldn't have happened, or having policies around building conversions in local plans, thinking about what good looks like. And of course, the temporary accommodation residents have been placed there by local government. Now, they'd often say, they're caught between a rock and a hard place, given the crisis in homelessness and budgets, and I do kind of understand that. One deputy leader of a local authority said to me in an interview, basically this developer had come to them and said, here's this scheme and there's 100 flats, do you want to use it for temporary accommodation? And she said she didn't really want to, but she was, one, having to struggle to find places for people, but two, really concerned that if she didn't, another local authority would. So there's lots of cases where local authorities are moving their residents to other local authorities and using their temporary accommodation. So it's that kind of Hobson's choice, I think, that they presented to. I also think it shows how a highly centralised planning system can actually be ill-informed about outcomes and with a really slow and difficult feedback. So Bartlett in 1983 described the UK as having a dual polity between the local and central state, where they're almost different worlds with really, difficult communication channels, little movement of personnel between them. And I think this one is the last slide. So I think that speaks to some current debates. So there's a current piece of work to introduce what are called National Development Management Policies, NDMPs, where there'll be less policies and local plans, and officials centrally will make more policies to apply in development management, which can be basically made and changed at ministerial whim. But I think the PDR debate shows why that may be problematic, because we don't actually have a tradition of doing those kinds of rules and regulations very well in this country, because we haven't had what's called an as-of-right planning system. We've had a discretionary planning system. So in our discretionary planning system, if you're taking a case-by-case view, you can kind of take an overall impression and stop something that's really, really poor happening. But if it's just about the strict compliance with the rules and regulations, those rules and regulations have to actually be quite sophisticated, as they are in some other countries, but haven't been here. And also, the PDR debacle, if I can call it that, showed the really slow and difficult feedback mechanisms. So local authority planners often knew quite quickly how problematic some of these schemes were, but it took from 2013 to 2020 for government centrally to do anything about that. And my final point, I suppose, is that given the longevity of the built environment and the difficulty changing things, particularly housing once it's developed, I think you have to get things right at the start. I think planning offers a unique opportunity space to try and exert regulatory control to actually require some basic minimum standards that support healthy homes. And if you don't do it then, it's really difficult to change things afterwards. I don't think anyone's quite sure what to do with these sort of poor quality PD schemes now they've been developed. So the question is, how best do we do that? If we want to talk about planning reform, how best do we do planning reform that doesn't weaken the ability of the state to uphold some basic standards of healthy home and life for its residents?
Okay, thank you very much, Ben. We do have time for a few questions. I actually live quite close to that, but not in it, fortunately. Very bleak, very fascinating. Have we produced the worst housing of any advanced nation? Yes or no?
I'd say yes, but
okay, you're allowed to.
The yes, but I suppose is that you can find poor quality housing all over the place, but in many cases that's not complying with regulations. So it's informal perhaps. Whereas in a sense, permitted development housing complied with the regulations. When I was doing the interviews, one of the interesting set of interviews was actually a couple of planning consultants I spoke to who worked on these sort of schemes. And I was sort of on my high horse talking to one and saying, how are you involved in these? And they're really awful. And he said, but they comply with the regulations. The government was allowing us to do this. And so why wouldn't you? And so for me, that's the crux. It's really, really poor quality housing, but it was perfectly allowed under the regulatory framework that the government had in place.
Okay, great. Questions?
Thanks. A fascinating, if deeply depressing presentation. Thank you. It's an observation that quite a few of your worst examples are in our post-war new towns. Harlow, Stevenage, Basildon, Crawley have really suffered. And your quote at the beginning, where you're talking about that socialist utopia, and I guess the implied criticism of that. Well, I guess how do we recapture some of that thing about the socialist utopia, where people moved into houses that had bedrooms and gardens and neighbourhood centres near them? So is there any way we can recapture an enthusiasm for some of the values that were in those post-war new towns, where people moved into good quality homes with decent space standards? That doesn't seem to be where some of the current debate is going around new towns, but is there any way we can recapture some of that and reclaim some of that enthusiasm?
In your research, you haven't talked about price differentiation at all. Now, presumably these properties are an awful lot cheaper or not?
I mean, I think that's the sort of enthusiasm and trying to get a guiding coalition for better quality housing is one of the big questions for us. I don't have a sort of magic wand to that. I think all you can do is perhaps point out the problems. I think it's naive just to think that policy will reflect evidence, but it's better to have some evidence than none at all as to the kind of detrimental impacts if you don't get it right and produce that. I also think it's about sort of campaigning organisations like the TCPA making the case for why healthy housing is so important and matters. I think also just calling out kind of politicians on this and being quite explicit about this has happened under your watch, under policy decisions you made. But it's difficult. It's really difficult because so much of the housing debate now is just almost reductive. It's almost, well, you know, there's massive demand for housing. So, I mean, I've had this before in a parliamentary select committee, and I was speaking directly after someone from let's say a deregulatory think tank who basically said that I was crying crocodile tears and that people are in desperate housing need, and I didn't want those people to have anywhere to live. And when you get down to that kind of argument, it's really difficult because you're saying, oh, I do want people to live. I just want everyone to have a decent place to live. In relation to the prices, we haven't done research on that ourselves. John Reeds, who's a colleague at CASA here at UCL, has done some analysis of that and found that they were a little bit cheaper, but not that much. They were a little bit cheaper, but they were usually smaller. Once you kind of adjusted for the space, they certainly weren't any cheaper. But basically, if there's a price you can charge in a particular housing market, then developers would charge that price. They won't be going much cheaper just because it's slightly poorer quality.
So we're going to take some more questions. I'm going to come over here. Just to note that this scheme is quite close to Beacon House that you showed. And Beacon House was the one on the North Circular.
Yep.
And there was a flat for sale, 3-bedroom last year, in Beacon House, £395,000. That was the one where you said you wouldn't want to open the window because you're right on the North Circular. It is amazingly convenient for a Nando's, which is located in the Tesco's opposite.
Yeah, Nick actually emailed me that one and asked if I'd like to live in a PD conversion.
Thank you very much for that. I'm actually really interested in your views on the concern that the office to resi PD conversion has had a really negative impact on the high streets.
Congratulations. I think this is a really balanced and informative presentation. When you've given it to some of the senior civil servants in the Department of Housing, Communities and Lunch, whatever it's called now, what's their reaction?
So, of course, it's not just office to residential, it's also retail to residential. And so I think that's where there's a particular concern. I mean, there can be concern about office space where there were examples of occupied or at least partially occupied office space. And then those uses were kicked out because landlords thought it's more valuable just to have it as housing. And so you're reducing the kind of employment use of certain town centres, and I think that can have detrimental impacts. I don't talk so much about retail to residential just because they're a smaller scale. They're sort of 1 or 2 flats rather than the 100 you might get in an office conversion. But the issues were the same in terms of quality, etc. What I think is the problem there is that there are perhaps uses other than residential that could still be valuable. There could be community uses. There could be uses that actually involve activity that brings people to high streets. And if you're just going, no, they're going to be housing, then actually that kills off the high street in effect. Retail patterns, obviously, as we kind of all know, have changed, are changing. And so the amount of retail space we need is going to be less in future. But I think you might want to think about how you manage that in a proactive way. So rather than just ending up with it down to the individual owner, and you can have a sort of pepper potting happening. And so one or two shops can go to housing in the middle of the high street, and then that decreases footfall, and then a few more go, and then actually basically that high street dies because you no longer have footfall. Whereas perhaps if there was a more proactive thing, that would say, well, this amount of space should still be in commercial use, this shouldn't, and do it in that way. So that's where I think there's a problem here.
So the reaction of the consultants?
Oh, yes. No, that was the reaction in government. I mean, to be fair, civil servants are obviously there to implement the policies of ministers. And I'm wondering how indiscreet I'll be, but there was one civil servant who, after we had the meeting, then on the way to the lift said to me, "Ben, I don't know why I fucking bother sometimes." So, really wasn't very happy with the policy. But certainly in the meetings, there was an interest in evidence, actually genuinely, where you could provide examples. So it'd be well, you say this is a problem, but can you actually provide the evidence of that? So there did seem a genuine interest. But there was also, and particularly under the previous government, although I think it might be the same under the current, quite a strong pushback because there's just this delivers more housing, and that's the headline. And it's just the number of units contributing to our 300,000 a year or 1.5 million in this parliament now that kind of dominates every discussion. You'd also get some interesting discussions. So I'd say, well, there's a loss of affordable housing, and they'd say, but none of these conversions would have happened without permitted development, so there isn't a loss of affordable housing. And I'd say, well, I think some of them would have happened if you'd required full planning permission, so there is a loss of affordable housing. And you'd have those sort of, back and forth discussions going forward. So there was an openness to evidence, but not an easy acceptance of any of the evidence, because there was an absolute clear political priority. We need to up the number of housing units delivered. And so if you're saying this needs planning permission, that might reduce that, and that would be problematic. And that seemed the most overriding concern.
Hi, Ben. Great talk and rather depressing, but of all of the environmental concerns that you listed, the mold, the air pollution, something you repeated a lot and something I saw in the quotes a lot was, of course, the overheating. And, air pollution, mold, generally associated with long-term chronic exposure conditions. There are some pre-existing conditions that expose people to acute problems, but overheating is an acute issue and it kills people. And I'm wondering, if there hasn't been a study on mortality during hot days in these dwellings, there are enough people here, hundreds of thousands of people living in these places, that there should be a study of excess mortality on hot days to work out whether this is killing people. And to me, this, could be the next national scandal, because overheating is deadly. And I'm wondering whether there has been a study, and if there hasn't been a study, what are the barriers to that study? Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation, Ben. I personally think that PDR should be scaled back to prior to 2013. But as you mentioned, there are the numbers we can't ignore. It's, according to government data, it's over 100,000 properties. They have been delivered, which is more than 5% of the total housing. So my question is, if you are given ministerial power today, and if you are asked to add, remove, or change one policy on PDR, office to residential, what would it be?
So in relation to the study, there isn't one. We're trying to incorporate that in our current study. So we've identified the addresses of 65,000 of these conversions, and so we were going to then look at NHS data, which is technically feasible. They can do it in an anonymised way for us to do that. But basically, NHS England being it was kind of in a crisis and now doesn't exist anymore as of today. So that's not going to happen. They just flat out said we can't have the data, not because it doesn't exist, not because it's not technically feasible, but just they will not supply it. So we're currently trying to work out, and this is my colleague Rob, who's a professor of health informatics, so he's trying to look at other data sets that might get us to trying to work out that issue, because there are some other potential local data sets that might help us with excess mortality. But we are trying to do that now, and so hopefully we might be able to say that more definitively in a year's time. There are some alarming figures that already exist, and just temporary accommodation is obviously much wider than just permitted development housing. But last year, 85 children died in temporary accommodation in England, because the government now report on those statistics. So we kind of know that evidence is there. We were getting anecdotal things in some of our focus groups, but obviously we want to do a slightly better study on that data. But I think there is a very, very real issue, absolutely. If I was minister, I would just stop these being permitted development. I would require things that create new dwellings to go through the planning permission process. Planning permission is not perfect. There's all kinds of issues with planning that we could talk about, but I think it's very clear in these cases, where you're creating housing where people live, given the implications that it does lead to better quality housing than permitted development. It's ministerial whim to make it permitted development. Ministerial whim could take it away from being permitted development and just put it back to planning permission. You'd also then actually just, I think, have a more level playing field. Everything that creates new dwellings goes through planning permission. I think it'd actually simplify things as well. One of the things about permitted development is it's a deregulation, but it's actually made things hugely complicated because those PD regs themselves are slightly complicated. They become more complicated over time. There's different regulations for different categories of it. So I'm not convinced it really simplifies the planning system that much. And now you've got this complex interaction of these two regulatory regimes. So in about a quarter of the buildings we looked at, there'd been both a permitted development and a planning permission, because the developer wants to change some floors that aren't an office, or they want to add an extension or something. And you can end up with these really complex interactions where if you just had a single consent, surely that's simpler actually.
It was really just an add-on to the overheating issue, because I think there's possibly some anecdotal evidence that it's not just in these types of housing, but new development generally is causing a lot of problems. So I just thought that was a point. But yeah, I think that's it. I would like to know what if any influence is being given to the whole national development management policies. I know that we've had consultation on that, but I don't know any sort of what is being done about influencing those sort of policies that are coming forward.
So not all new build housing that's gone through planning permission is good at all. And my colleague Matthew Carmona and the Place Alliance have produced quite an interesting evidence set on quite a few of the design issues that are more generally affecting new housing across England. And so, it's not that I'm claiming that they're absolutely getting it right. It's just that it seems that the conditions can be worse in these permitted development homes than would have been the case under planning permission. I think there is still a potential piece of work around the national development management policies. So that's kind of active work that's going on at the moment to develop those. It's interesting to see what will go in them. It's also interesting to see, are they just issues that then cannot be covered at all in a local plan, or are they kind of minimums that you could then exceed if you can justify it in your local plan? And I think there's quite a difficult issue that we're trying to apply rules across the whole of England when actually the viability picture, the real estate markets are really quite different across this country. And so if we're trying to perhaps get into some housing standards issues, what we're applying, there should be some universal minimums, absolutely, but you can actually require better standards in London than elsewhere in England. So are we going to have lower standards than we have in London at the moment to make it viable in the northeast of England, or what? I think there's an unresolved question there.
Seeing the floor plan of the room that doesn't need a window and the 13 square meters with a bed in front of the door. I'm just quite concerned in terms of fire regulations, and if that bed is now blocking my door and I can't get out, but also seeing the floor plan from a building perspective, are the fire regulation routes in terms of people being able to escape from these buildings, is that being met? We talk about loss of life, and that seems like a high item on the list.
So we're at the edge of my own expertise there, so I can't claim my own personal insight, but it's one of the issues we're trying to look at in the current project a little bit. So we're working with colleagues from TCPA in that project, and that's one of the things they're trying to speak to regulators about to understand a bit more. In theory, fire regulations would be one of the things that should apply to these, the same as any other housing. And so those minimum standards should be required. I think one of the questions is, in practice, is this what's happening? So in practice, some of these really poor quality conversions are not complying. I've been in one in Croydon where a resident invited me in, and I'm no expert, but I know that the walls should be able to withstand fire for 30 minutes at least. And these were like plywood. They'd basically divided the office building up with bits of plywood, and that was clear to me that wouldn't. Also, I couldn't get out the building because the fire escape was locked. So I reported that one, and to be fair, the London Fire Brigade went the next day and took enforcement action because it was so problematic. There's been a fire at one conversion in Croydon called Sycamore House. There's been a scheme in Harlow, Shields House, I think it's called, but that's now been evacuated because the Essex Fire Service served an enforcement notice requiring that. And there seem to be particular issues in those schemes with the sort of degree of containerisation of flats, because that's how the kind of fire safety is presumed to work on blocks of flats in this country. So I think there are issues. I think we don't fully understand the degree of the issues at the moment.
Okay, Ben, thank you very much for a wonderful and depressing talk this evening. Thank you very much, Ben.